I'd like to welcome everyone to today's 9th Annual Student Symposium, The Politics of Choice. We have some remarkably astute and insightful students who have worked so hard to put together, and today to present some really fascinating papers looking at the politics of choice for artists and those working within the artistic sphere. We've decided to divide today's symposium up into two parts. The first comprising papers looking at the politics of choice in public spaces, defined rather broadly, then the second will be on the politics of choice in museum and gallery spaces. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Stephen Mandrevelis, who is going to be our respondent today, to lead us into our first group.
Thank you, Adira, for that nice introduction. My name is Stephen Mandrevelis, and I am Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And I would first like to thank the Hunter for once again hosting this wonderful event for the 9th time. Two other quick notes of thanks. First, I want to thank all of you, the audience, for spending your Saturday afternoon with us and supporting these students in what is, for many of them, their first professional presentation. And second, thank you to our student presenters. You've all worked incredibly hard on these papers over the past few months, and you should be very proud of the presentations that you've prepared. When Adira and I first started to speak about this symposium's theme, we were struck not just by the implications of choice, but also by the location of choice. Choice is, after all, a relational act. It's a decision amongst options, a personal selection from an array of different social possibilities. To choose, then, is not just to exercise one's agency, but to define that agency, to locate it within or outside of a larger social field. The 4 papers in our first session investigate this relational act, both in its historical and present-day manifestations. In turn, they reveal a dialogue between art and its public, between the personal sphere and the social sphere, where choices made in art reflect the decisions sanctioned within that public space. Our first paper will be given by Gabrielle Patron. Gabrielle is a junior at Rhode Island College, majoring in painting and also art history. Her paper is entitled Revealing the Exposed Black Woman, a study of Marie Benoit's portrait of Madeline. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Gabrielle and welcome all to the start of our symposium.
Revealing the Exposed Black Woman, a study of Marie Benoit's portrait of Madeline. At the turn of the 19th century, the French public was both enamored and repulsed by the sight of Marie Guillaume Benoit's portrait of Madeline. France was writhing in the aftermath of the revolution, political tensions were running high, and the recent emancipation of colonial slaves in 1794 was still a point of contention. Benoit channeled the surrounding turmoil into one of her most notable paintings. Viewers face a woman known only today as Madeline, a former slave turned servant. Benoit forces onlookers to confront treatments of race and gender, coupling the woman's direct stare, singular exposed breast, and high contrast of dark skin against white garments. At the time, the image of the Black woman, especially nude, was enveloped in perverse sexual fascination and racist fetishism, along with the belief that women of color were innately impure, immoral, and deviant. Black women became a, quote, black stain, unquote, a perpetual symbol of otherness that they could not escape. While the majority of 19th century works featuring exposed Black women are shrouded in inferiority, racism, and patriarchal attitudes, scholars debate whether Benoit's portrait should be included into the same oeuvre. Upon closer examination of the work and consideration of the artist, I explored the negative tropes associated with Black female figures perpetuated in 19th century visual culture in conjunction with the political will of the artist. I framed the distinctions between Benoit's sitter and the portrayal of exposed Black women within the broader scope of 19th century artwork as a deliberate choice that influenced the portrayal and reception of her subject. including the race and gender of the artist, the iconographic elements surrounding Madeline, and the sitter's conformity to bourgeois culture. My reading nuances the iconography of nudity as a political choice in Benoit's portrait. I argue that Benoit redefined how an exposed woman of color could be represented in the prestigious French salon and emphasized how this act embodied strides towards racial and female liberation. Born into an aristocratic family, Benoit benefited from a professional art education, a rarity during a time when there were few artistic opportunities for women. She studied painting along with notable French female artists, including Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and helped to establish a precedent of female participation at the French Salon. Benoit challenged many of the social and artistic conventions of her time by creating history paintings, a genre reserved for male capabilities. In the 19th century, the sexualization and objectification of Black female subjects were typically a byproduct of patriarchal and colonial attitudes. While both white and Black women were victims of an unbalanced social structure, the Black female body became a symbol for the sexual deviancy and immorality of all women. Since Benoit was a female artist, one must consider how the female perspective influenced the rendering of an exposed sitter. Benoit's male contemporaries capitalized on tropes that popularized the sexualization of Black women, often referencing Sarchi Sarah Bartman, an indigenous African woman whose naturally voluptuous figure was exhibited publicly in London in 1810. Her body was popularly used to justify the hypersexualization of all Black women. The views on Bartman's body aligned with the popular belief that the physiognomy of people of color were indicators of Black inferiority. In considering Portrait of Madeline, Benoit invites associations with this visual precedent by exposing one of her breasts. However, Madeline's direct eye contact simultaneously rejects it and reclaims a sense of self-authority. Similarly, Sander Gilman explains that visualizations of prostitution reinforce the image of a sexualized Black woman, usually with a white prostitute and Black servant. At the time, women who dared to embrace sexual freedom and in turn rejected white feminine purity were equated to the purported animalistic desires of Black women. The most notable 19th century work that deals with this trope is Edward Manet's Olympia. Here, the presence of the Black servant Laura stands to highlight the sexual promiscuity and deviance of the nude white sex worker Olympia. James Smalls argues that one can see Benoit's feminine perspective reflected through her sitter. Instead of overtly sexualizing Madeline to satisfy her male audience, Benoit taps into these larger concepts concerning race and gender. Additionally, Lisa Farrington writes that when a woman paints herself or another woman nude, there is a, quote, self-referential fluency exposed breasts, majority of 19th and the portrayal of. Born into an aristocratic family, Benoit benefited from the relies on tropes that popularized the sexualization of Black women, often referencing Sarchi Sarah Bartman, an indigenous African woman whose naturally voluptuous figure was animalistic desires of Black women. The most notable 19th century work that deals with this trope is Edward Manet's Olympia. Here, the presence of the Black servant Laura stands to highlight the sexual promiscuity and deviance of the nude white sex worker Olympia. James Smalls argues that one can see Benoit's feminine perspective reflected through her sitter. Instead of overtly sexualizing Madeline to satisfy her male audience, Benoit taps into these larger concepts concerning race and gender. Additionally, Lisa Farrington writes that when a woman paints herself or another woman nude, there is a, quote, self-referential fluency that allows for more expansive and less trivialized gaze. The artist becomes the object of her own self-reflexive desires, as well as an active surveyor of her own body, ultimately rejecting the presence of the male artist viewer, end quote, reclaiming dominion over them, end quote. If viewed from the lens of feminine self-reflexivity, Portrait of Madeline stands beyond the typical tropes of exposed Black women made for and by men and could appeal to a collective female audience instead. Benoit made the conscious choice to render her subject in a way that deviated against social norms and thus creates an overt political statement towards race and gender. The iconography of Madeleine's exposed breasts means more than the sexualization of the Black female body. Images of the bare breasts in French art, such as Peace Bringing Back Abundance by Benoit's female mentor Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and In the Spring by Jean-Marc Nautier, symbolize, according to Lilia Richardson, a goddess or, quote, personification of female divinity, end quote. The bare breast is also commonly associated with allegories of liberty, like in Eugene Delacroix's later painting, Liberty Leading the People. The strong allegorical associations with Madeleine's exposed breast thereby indicate underlying political context of the French Revolution and liberation, thus giving the sitter symbolic meaning beyond her sexuality. There is also deliberate conservativeness in Madeleine's exposure that desexualizes her. For instance, Madeleine's garments do not slip precariously from her shoulders, as Benoit's do in her own self-portrait for the 1786 Exposition de la Jeunesse. Even though Benoit's full breast is not exposed, one can glimpse a hint of her areola, and coupled with her tilted head, beckoning stare, and cheeky hints at a smile, she presents herself as playfully receptive to the advances of a male viewer. Madeleine, on the other hand, while fully exposed to the audience, stares coldly outward with a rigid posture and not the slightest tilt to her head. It is therefore telling that Benoit did not use the same allusions to promiscuity on her Black subject that she did on herself, especially given the 19th century artists tended to visually exploit Black women's alleged sexual deviancy. Additionally, if both breasts were exposed, one may liken the image of Madeleine to a Black servant or slave, who are often depicted topless. The choice to associate Madeleine with a tradition of artistic allegorical nudity further differentiates her from the fetishized illustrations like Sarah Bartman. Despite the fact that Madeleine was Benoit's servant, Madeleine's rendering likens her to the bourgeois class. The elevation of the Black subject is another way that Benoit's painting subverts typical 19th century visual tropes that disparaged people of color. For instance, the ornate trim of the chair, the luxurious blue drapery, and Madeleine's pensive composure move her closer into the realm of the white artist and away from the harmful stereotypes associated with slavery. According to Suzanne Waller, Madeleine also wears, quote, fashionable dress of the period, end quote, and her pose is, quote, similar to Jacques-Louis David's depiction of Madame Raymond de Vernat, end quote. The chair in both sitters, for instance, contains similar golden trim, plush cushioning, and both women wear silky white garments. As a student of David, it is unsurprising that Benoit would adopt a similar style of portraiture. She may have even drawn directly from David's portrait, as it was painted only a few years before Madeleine. Benoit's other portraits of bourgeois women, such as Portrait of a Lady and Madame Philippe and her son Eugene, also feature similar dress and elegant furniture that mirror Benoit's depiction of Madeleine. Applying a bourgeois style to a Black woman in a racist elitist society would have been striking. According to Janelle Hobson's article, Portraits of Black Womanhood, Madeleine's body language, such as her hands draped guardedly across her abdomen, could be read as a sign of self-assertion, which was very atypical in depictions of Black subjects. One can look at a later example, Eakin's female model, and compare how Benoit made her sitter address the audience as in traditional bourgeois portraiture, whereas Eakin's model looks down forlornly off to the side. Madeleine's breast is prominently exposed and she appears assertive. The later sitter is hunched, attempting to conceal her naked chest, and she seems extremely vulnerable in her exposure. Instead, Madeleine's depiction harkens closer to the later works of Afro-Native American artist Edmonia Lewis, such as her sculpture Forever Free, which intentionally forgoes nudity and Black physiognomy to depict a freed woman's emergence into white society. Portrait of Madeleine remains a curious anomaly in the collection of 19th century works that portray the exposed Black woman. When combing through countless depictions of sexualization, degradation, and subordination of Black women, it can be tempting to view Benoit's sitter in the same light. However, in taking time to consider the gender of the artist, iconographic elements, and the influence of the culture and class, Portrait of Madeleine must be regarded outside the typical modes of art in the 19th century. As a female artist, Benoit was able to emulate and sympathize with the feminine perspective, drawing on themes of race, gender, and social status to link, quote, the issues of slavery and the condition of woman, end quote, in France as a political imperative. Still, audiences must consider why Benoit decided to redefine how an exposed woman of color should be represented in the prestigious French visual culture. There never be a concrete answer, But the image of a former slave dressed as a bourgeois woman seems to highlight the progress of colonial emancipation and the reminder that there is still work to be done to achieve female and racial liberation. Considering the precarious political situation of her time, Benoit must have known that she would face backlash, strongly alluding to the deliberateness of her choice to go against cultural and political norms for portraying women of color. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. As a reminder, the chat is open. So if you do have any questions during the presentations, feel free to write your question in the chat. We will come back to them during our question and answer period at the end of this session. Our second paper is by Madison Cawthorn and expands upon this theme of self-definition. Madison is a senior at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and her paper is titled "The Characterization of Satan in Paradise Lost and its Correlation to the Complexities of Human Nature." Madison, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Hi, my name is Madison Cawthorn. Today I'll be discussing the characterization of Satan in Paradise Lost and its correlation to wider anti-heroism. So you might be wondering, what constitutes as an anti-hero? An anti-hero, especially in current cinema, can take so many different forms. But according to Merriam-Webster, an anti-hero can be defined as a protagonist or notable figure who is conspicuously lacking in heroic qualities. This can encompass a wide variety of traits, such as selfish motivations, crass attitudes, or human shortcomings. So now that we know what an anti-hero is, let's look at some great examples. So first off, we have Hamlet, the titular character of Shakespeare's work, The Tragedy of Hamlet. In this work, while Hamlet is shown to have heroic motivations of avenging his father, he descends into madness and often ostracizes the people that he loves, thus making him very much an atypical hero. Next, we have Harley Quinn and Scarlett O'Hara. Now, despite both of these women being from different time periods, they both encapsulate what it means to be an anti-hero. In both films, women display atypical traits in their heroic deeds, which definitely makes them not quite what we think of when we think of a hero or protagonist in a film. Finally, we have Rick Sanchez from Rick and Morty. Now, you might be thinking, why did I choose someone from an adult cartoon to discuss what it means to be an anti-hero? Well, Rick Sanchez is actually very similar to Satan, also known as Lucifer in Paradise Lost. While both are known for their prodigious talents, they both are victims to human shortcomings, such as their pride, as well as their ragtag group of teens. So now you might be thinking, why Paradise Lost versus many of the other works we just discussed? Well, Paradise Lost is a work rife with discussion and controversy. For centuries, historians, academics, authors, and more have discussed why this poem is so important, as well as the important motifs that are seen throughout the novel, such as the war between light and darkness, as well as what it means to have human complexity. Satan in particular really displays these traits throughout the novel, from his organization to a rebellion in heaven, to his downfall, as well as his tempting of Adam and Eve towards the end of the novel. Satan shows a gradual translation into the villain that we know today. However, he shows many sympathetic traits as well, such as his alluring beauty, as well as his complexity, which makes him a very interesting encapsulating character indeed. So you might be thinking, what makes Satan's characterization so important in Milton's work compared to literally any other? Well, Satan prior to this work was often depicted as a Pan-like figure. An example of this depiction would be Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy, where Satan is depicted not only as a Pan-like figure, but as something not only to be revered, but also monstrous and wallowing in shame as he is frozen from waist down due to God's punishment. So very much a medieval portrayal of Satan. Next, we have Milton's portrayal, which greatly contrasts this medieval image, and that Satan is not only beautiful, but something to be revered, and as an object of beauty and something we can project ourselves upon, which makes him a more sympathetic villain than other depictions in the past. Finally, we have the depiction of Satan, or Mephistopheles, a Satan-like figure, in Dr. Faustus, where he is depicted in a red jumpsuit, and the image that we actually know of Satan today, that you might see on album covers of explicit music. And now we have a more contemporary example of the TV show Lucifer, which is very much encapsulates Milton's Satan that we see in Paradise Lost, in that he is very handsome, but he's also a Machiavellian type figure that we see in Dr. Faustus, kind of fusing both together, which is a very interesting shift in comparison to how it all began. So you may be thinking now, what does Satan's characterization reflect in regards to human individualization, not only in cinema and literature, but also beyond? Historically, Satan in Paradise Lost is among one of the first modern anti-heroes in modern literature. This is extremely important in that it started one of the first film and literature tropes that we still see today, and is also a reflection of the tension and philosophic development during the scientific enlightenment, which was actually had begun when Milton was writing Paradise Lost. The scientific enlightenment actually was caused by partially inspired by the Crusades, where religious nihilism was beginning to grow all across Europe. And Milton's work reflects this. Satan, also known as Lucifer in Paradise Lost, he not only shows that war between light and darkness, but also one very important trait, which is the idea of self-definition. This is something that we all in our lives begin to do, particularly when we are teenagers, which is very comparable to what Satan was going through as he was gathered up his band of rebellious angels, only to be prepared to be casted out of heaven, all in pursuit to be able to define oneself. And he went from an ethereal place to a world of chaos. What one could even compare to our current state of the pandemic, where we went from a completely normal current, I dare say, very nonchalant existence, to now what one could consider a world of chaos. And now we are trying to self-define through numerous means, whether it's religion or philosophy, or even technology, which I believe is very significant. The viewing of Satan, not only just as a hero or a villain, is very much parallels our own as we continue to define ourselves throughout the ages. And not only that, instead of seeing the world as black or white, we are now beginning to see the world in shades of gray, as George R.R. Martin has said. I would love to thank the Hunter Museum, Dr. Stephen Mandrevelis, Adara Kasi, as well as the Village for supporting me on this endeavor. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madison. Our third paper is going to continue this indulgence of these devilish implications as Jacob Rayner looks at the implications of greed and Wall Street. A sophomore at Stony Brook University. Jacob's paper is entitled Charging Bull: Power, Capitalism, Greed, Confidence, Fear, and Wealth. Jacob, I now hand things over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Rayner. I'm an undergraduate student at Stony Brook University, and I study art history and criticism. And I'm going to present to you guys on Arturo Dematica's Charging Bull today. So thank you very much for joining and listening. The larger-than-life bronze bull, oars lowered, gazes down on Broadway almost in challenge. His nostrils are flared enough to cause deep wrinkles to form above them, and his tail whips with great flare above his hind legs. The head is ever so slightly canted against the body, positioned well below the shoulder profile in markedly tense position. There's an absence of definitive malice in Charging Bull. His eyes are slightly narrowed, the mouth not quite snarling, but perhaps closer to an ambiguous smirk. It's charging, and it's aggravated for sure, but at whom or what? But it is not just a decided lack of certain aggression which affords the piece its dynamism. Its placement and its subject matter are also important artistic choices, affecting how the piece is interpreted over time. Arturo Dematica's best-known work, the now iconic sculpture, exhibits an impressive combination of artistic ability with an external political choices of context, creating a work like no other in its sheer ability to uphold its relevance with the passing of time. Italian immigrant Arturo Dematica began work on Charging Bull in 1987 after the Black Monday stock market crash, wanting to create a sculpture that captured the spirit of American financial optimism. After moving to the United States, penniless, he felt particularly indebted to the country for its opportunities for success. Designing a sculpture which he believed would bolster confidence in the market and in the institutions which supported it. Dematica financed the sculpture himself for about $320,000, sculpting and then casting the piece in bronze at a foundry. In a now famous and almost defining act of guerrilla art, Dematica and a group of friends rented heavy equipment and placed the statue in front of the New York Stock Exchange without permit or notification to city officials. The act alone of its placement without permission was merely a political performance artwork in itself. The sculptor and his friends stayed with the statue to hand out pamphlets explaining the work to passersby and commuters, but not for long, as the statue was soon impounded by the city. Remarkably, though, the statue was merely relocated to the Bowling Green by request of the Parks Department, where it now remains. It is still known, however, as the Wall Street Bull, and its associations with Wall Street have only strengthened with time. Its associations with such a historically successful financial system have made it an artwork associated with wealth and privilege, with copies of the statues appearing outside the Mumbai Stock Exchange and the Sao Paulo Stock Exchange, and also a genuine Dematica replica in Shanghai. Charging Bull finds itself an international figurehead of New York or even American financial prowess. After all, the figure would not exist were it not for the stock market crash in 1987, and it was left as a gift in front of the stock exchange. That it has become a symbol of the financial district is of little wonder. These deliberate artistic choices by Dematica leave no room for doubt that the artist intended this piece to have to do with capital in general and Wall Street in particular. However, this choice to epitomize the investment in commercial banks, stock exchanges, and all other businesses of which Wall Street is comprised is a choice which has aged less than favorably in the mind of the average working class American. It places Charging Bull at odds with the younger generation growing up in the shadow of wealth and income inequality, largely caused by the same institutions which Dematica has forever symbolized. The 2011 Occupy Wall Street protests found Charging Bull not a symbol of the possibilities of the capitalist system, but by then a long-standing symbol of wealthy, powerful Wall Street establishment. The first major call to arms graphic featuring the bull was an Adbusters poster, a ballerina poised calmly atop the statue. Rather than interpret its ambiguous charge as towards a better future, an angry and disillusioned public envisioned it as a charge aimed at the working class. Dematica's artistic choices are ever relevant. The statue was a rallying point for several anti-capitalist protests and demonstrations, with the image circulating popularly in other graphics in the Occupy movement, an already well-established figurehead of what the protesters were fighting. In Arturo Dematica's making the statue a symbol of the system which brought him success, he was also making it a symbol of the system which had made success impossible for some. The work was often compared to a biblical golden calf, a group of religious protesters going so far as to carry a small homemade replica of the statue to highlight the sculpture's similarity to the Judeo-Christian parable and the warnings that the story bears. There exists obvious connotations for the stock market in phrases like bull market or bull investor. However, the bull itself is a symbol that's been associated with masculinity, in a tradition dating back millennia. The bull's strength, fertility, and often bellicose nature position it as a potent symbol of power and machismo. It being a charging bull conjures to the mind ideas of anger and violence, or perhaps images of bullfighting, a long historied performance art of exaggerated and often ostentatious machismo. The image of the charging bull also comes out of a larger art historical context of works which often use the animal to convey ideas of danger and strength. Demonica's conscious decision to choose the subject matter includes a desire for the artwork with an association with strength and masculinity. The statue has itself become a symbol of virility, with thousands of tourists come to the sculpture's oversized testicles for photographs with them and to rub them for good luck. They have become, over the years, noticeably more polished than the rest of the body, testifying to the potency of its masculine imagery. Demonica's intersections with the concept of masculinity in Wall Street were clear and understandable in the context of Black Monday. However, these concepts have aged in the contemporary viewer's eyes to represent an old, outdated, exclusionary way of life. Charging bulls come to represent the male-dominated finance industry and patriarchal domination of finances as a whole, from the household level of control of income to the gender pay gap to the boardrooms of the major banks and investment firms. It has drawn the ire of feminists and progressives who see the sculpture in its oversized and masculine pose, as though it's tossing its head towards them in challenge. There is sufficient evidence on part of the progressive that Demonica's sculpture as a symbol of not just masculinity, but toxic masculinity, as it has become known. Its muscled body, lowered horns, and massive size are intimidating, and with its prominently displayed undercarriage, it can feel as though it's an imposing and aggressive testament to male dominance. Such is the wonderful fluidity of Demonica's work. In an ironic, counterintuitive, and perhaps subversive move, the asset management company State Street Global Advisors commissioned the statue Fearless Girl and placed it opposite Charging Bull. The statue is a bronze, 50-inch tall sculpture of a young girl, hands on her hips, staring defiantly up at Demonica's work. Inscribed at a plaque on her feet, know the power of women in leadership. She makes a difference. Its irony lies in that SSGA holds $4.14 trillion in assets. It's the quintessential established male-dominated Wall Street firm Charging Bull has come to symbolize, and it has paid nearly $5 million in gender discrimination claims. It's the very enemies that the bronze girls imagine fight. Charging Bull, with changing times and context of external factors of Fearless Girl, can still remain a coherent and relevant work with meaningful commentary. The work's expressive form is Demonica, arriving poor and finding success, builds a testament to the financial opportunities afforded to American citizens. Changing financial circumstances for a new generation brings about a shift in the interpretation of the artwork, from a testament of can-do optimism to the dangers of unchecked capitalism. Charging Bull is a now inseparable icon of the New York Stock Exchange and the American economy as a whole. The piece's interpretation has changed several times over in its relatively short time on display since 1989, and the piece's interpretation has swung sharply from that of a comment on American can-do attitude to a symbol of the ultra-wealthy and their power over the lives of the everyday citizen. Thank you guys so much for listening, and it's been a great pleasure to write and present to you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I mean this as a complete compliment, but I think Gordon Gecko would be proud. The final paper and of our session continues on with this idea of social challenge. And it comes to us from Isabella Tallman-Jones, a senior at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Her paper, entitled Beardsley's Comfort in the Grotesque, Exploring the Amorphous Masculine Identity, Making the Spaces of Otherness, will begin momentarily. Isabella, I'd now turn it over to you.
Hello, my name is Isabella Tallman-Jones. I'm currently an undergrad student studying illustration as well as art history at the Savannah College of Art and Design. And I'm happy to say that I'm finally going to be moving on to my master's program in art history as well at the University of Georgia. But before I introduce my paper, I'd just like to thank the Hunter Museum for hosting this event and inviting me to present. This is going to be one of my first forays into this art historical world. So I'm glad to be sharing this paper about one of my favorite illustrators, someone who's inspired both my writing as well as my creations. As we can see right here, this portrait of Aubrey Beardsley actually was something that I made before I even considered writing this paper. So I'm glad to have it accompanying this. But the title is Beardsley's Comfort in the Grotesque, Exposing the Amorphous Masculine Identity, Making Space for Otherness. Without further ado, Aubrey Vincent Beardsley. He was born in 1872 in the southeast of England. He was born impoverished, diagnosed a consumptive child at an early age, and labeled a social pariah. For these reasons and others, he gravitated towards the arts. Following his increased interest in the arts, he gathered his greatest influences from the Pre-Raphaelites and the newly popular Japonism style, which he incorporated into Art Nouveau, which he would be classified with today. He went on to lead a brief life as an editorial illustrator until his passing at the young age of 25. Beardsley's Salome illustrations were to accompany Salome, the play by Oscar Wilde. They cracked the nationalistic echo chamber of the end of the century Victorian London. Apart from his prolific catalog of illustrations and association with Wilde, there's more to be said about his pioneering perspective in exposing the fragility of the male gaze, the body, and sexuality. I will be introducing one of these works from his collection, The Climax, it's entitled, by examining the piece through gender politics, aesthetics, the societal context, and the fears of late Victorian men, as well as a unique queer lens. His perspective resonates even today with the nuanced approach born in part of his childhood struggles. This examination concludes with the question of whether Beardsley accomplishes what others in his time were unable to do, to abstract the delineation of vice and virtue, to make a way for the age of dandyism, debauchery, liberation, and the quintessence of Beardsley's new woman, as I say, which is referring to his artistic reinvention of the conventional subservient young girl that we see a lot in the art of his time, as well as what was preceding in classical art. In favor of a bold, confrontational, sexually self-aware woman. Aubrey Beardsley sought to conjoin polarizing cultures from tyrannically rigid Vienna and London to the sexually liberated and free-thinking France and Japan. He infiltrated the global consciousness of aesthetics with the utilization of the grotesque. The queering of norms and the imaginative chaos of Beardsley made the pathology of his corporeal individual existence. He was an agent of both the grotesque and, quote, otherness in his wavering health, ambiguous sexual identity, and perhaps the physical and artistic manifestations of his idiosyncrasies. In his pain, there is pleasure, beauty in the grotesque, delectable sin and pious virtue, elements that all played and intermingled into an amorphous Beardsleyan wonderland. The examination will focus on exploring one historical look at female archetypes in patriarchal art and how he fought back at this, two, his cultivation of the space for otherness and queerness, disability, and forbidden love, with xenophobic outrage and dangerous desire. And three, I'll be concluding with what he may have intended through his interpretation of the play with queer utopian desires and male dystopian fears. Beardsley often used grotesque female figures as an apparatus of terror and erotica. In European Orientalist art, the employment of the odalisque provides a subservient and demure living fetish for the male gaze. While the eyeline of the reclined harem woman commonly appears as obsequious, avoiding, or in trance, Beardsley's women stare back. This disruption and publicization of a man's private vices evoke shame, disgust, and a primitive hatred. Beardsley's female gaze, in contrast to the turn-of-the-century male gaze, challenges the masculine ideal of the depiction of a woman to be one of two Freudian categories, the Madonna or the whore. Aubrey Beardsley's influences on the Viennese artists are seen in their use of the female archetypal figure as a totem for perversion in play. For example, one of those Viennese artists was Gustav Klimt. He often used these biblical characters for that purpose. Specifically, biblical women perfectly encapsulated the fears of men, their dangerous desires and wishes, and the birth of original sin. Beardsley's Salome illustration, The Climax, which we'll proceed to talk about in a minute, can be compared to Judith in the Head of Holofernes or Judith I. They both share this motif of the sinful, lustful, confrontational succubus. Salome and Judith are both the heroine and the woman scorned, the femme fatale, victorious in holding up the trophy of their decapitated victim. Gruesome and grotesque, yet sadistically inviting. There's a terrifying realization in the new woman exhibiting both the role of the porter of life and of death, the alpha and the omega, the gatekeeper of cyclical existence. The climax is quite literally the pinnacle of the play, as its title suggests, but also a Beardslayan double entendre. At the moment of suspense, the viewer is a captive audience a forced voyeur to the floating and villainous Salome that holds her beloved John the Baptist, now decapitated. In her clutch, the serpent-haired head hovers above the abstract flourish meant to represent blood. The blood trickles down in such a way to resemble a phallus. Beside the pool of blood, a flower emerges from the foreground in sharp contrast with this theatrical, gruesome imagery. The Medusa illusion in the work also oozes this sexuality and strongly suggestive allusion to the phallus yet again. A perverse scene encapsulates the orgasmic satisfaction of slaying her object of desire in an act of vengeance and obsessive possession. An illusion of sexual gratification is also present in both pieces. The orgasmic glare of Judith works in tandem with the scene of apotheosis in Wilde's play. Salome is moments away from indulging in her forbidden love and lust, while Judith lingers in the satisfaction of her prized disembodied head. The gaze of these two once again harkens the confrontational nature and disrupted gaze of the odalisques. These images seem designed to upset the male gaze, intentional disturbance in the masculine stability in an age of women's suffrage in the fight for bodily autonomy. The difference between the villainous woman and the puritanical young girl leave little room for gray areas in the eyes of the voyeur. Madonna and horror, pious virgin and corrupt harlot, all the while infantilizing women for the purposes of fetish, delegitimizing their intelligence, sentience, and autonomy. Beardsley's work vehemently opposes the late Victorian self-imposed necessity for a library of ageless and perpetual archetypes to categorize and subjugate. By maintaining an unchangeable maternal image, women can continue to be denied individuality and equity while simultaneously being idealized, fetishized, and worshipped as a piece of iconography rather than a human being, eliminating any sort of progress that they could have in their position in the modern world. Aubrey Beardsley pushes towards progress in the representation of his new woman in exchange for these timeless images that reveal the society spectacle of femininity. Aubrey Beardsley challenges Victorian notions of sexuality and power, placing the power in the hands of the sexually self-assured new woman rather than patriarchal standards made to conquer women. The ambiguity surrounding her gender, for example, grants the character access to resonate with the individual viewer's own perspective, a subject for universally shared suffering and empathy. Beardsley's illustrations were in essence a parody of the once established Freudian truth, meant to demolish this standard in favor of a more nuanced take, incorporating the vast spectrum of sexuality and gender. Queer non-conforming individuals gravitated towards Beardsley's work and recognized the implication of queer connections and desires as one with limitless potential. Beardsley acknowledges women, queer, and disabled people in a rare and empathetic light. By shifting the societal power imbalances and even imaginary scene, the bodily representation of illicit love is revolutionary and unique to Beardsley and Oscar Wilde's creations. The idea of forbidden love was undoubtedly accessible to a multitude of queer identities. Modern American author and activist Leslie Feinberg comments on the shared struggles among the queer community imagined, quote, "Loneliness had become an environment. The air I breathed, the spatial dimension in which I was trapped," end quote. There is room for identifying with Salome and her imprisonment and the subsequent persecution of her transgressive sexuality, as she is the unconventional woman, the masculine woman, the aggressive, sexually liberated woman. The existence and acknowledgement of queerness and queering of the body presentation or possible dynamics in non-normative relationships is a challenge to traditional notions of progress. Disgust for unacceptable otherness carried wholly sinister implications of the danger of interaction between the oppressor and the queer/crip subject. Brought on by intrinsic male fears of the unknown and incomprehensible, these frustrations gave way to a lethal aggression, but also a dual sense of revulsion and attraction. The patriarchal anxieties, desires to be at peace with whatever contingencies stand in their way are finally extinguished, penetrated, conquered, and subjugated. Disgust and lust, fear and desire, subjugation and fetishization. Within a Beardsleyan world, Salome offers a newfound multiplicity of perspectives. Beardsley's utopia is a haven of illusory security, acting as a cheap, albeit replica, of the queer imaginary utopia of his mind's eye. As scholar Amanda Thibodeau notes, I read utopian queerness in the eroticism of the unknown and incomprehensible, the desire across a boundary we consider uncrossable, end quote. The use of androgyny to represent desires one can't have, the wantonness of the male, and the torture brought on by his simultaneously sexual curiosity, intrigue, and disgust. Perhaps Beardsley's gender-bending worlds were the product of his social dreaming, wishes for a world of queerness and acceptance of the invalids and deviants, labels that he self-identified with. Our scars can attract a solidarity of those who have been othered, identified with a new, intimate, and unified image. Salome is the conduit to which queer men and women find comfort and solace. To vicariously live through her raging vengeance in the name of desire, there's a satisfaction to be gained in the subtlety of Wilde and Beardsley's reinterpretation of this biblical parable. Not tales of morality and virtue, but sentiments of sexual liberty, specifically feminine sexuality, which undermines the dominance that men have created and fetishized for themselves out of necessity. Ultimately, Aubrey Beardsley operated on his own terms in his own world. He lived on, quote, queer time. Queering the very notion of time meant making space on the periphery of reality, a point of respite in the universe's fabric of chaos. Beardsley's timeless invention of an oasis to vicariously live in and escape for the shared trauma of the queer mind. Disregarding the sexual ambiguity of Aubrey Beardsley, there's still a present queerness that he embraced and exuded with grace. And for all of those reasons, I really admire Aubrey Beardsley, and that concludes my paper. I'm really glad to be sharing a little bit more about my favorite illustrator, and I hope that you could take something from this and maybe see that although this is an artist coming from late Victorian England, there's quite a nuanced perspective to the visual language and imagery that he's using in his illustrations. And I always recommend that more people check out the Salome illustrations. There's a big collection that is held in the Met, and there's so much more to be said about it. But with the little time that we have, I thank you for listening to my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabella. And also thank you once again to all of our presenters in this first session. If I could invite the and so the four of you to turn your cameras on. I do believe they are all on, actually. But we have about 20 minutes or so and for discussion and questions. So if anyone in the audience does have any questions for our presenters, please just put them in the chat and I shall ask them out front. I do have a few prepared remarks here, but I don't want to drone on too long here, so I will keep these remarks relatively brief, and then I'll get the conversation started by asking a question of our panelists. When I was first looking at the four of these papers together, I was wondering what it was I could say to tie them all together. We have four different media. We have first going in reverse order. So we have illustrations. We have a sculpture. We have a book and a piece of literature, and as well as a painting. We have three different historical periods, and so three come from the 19th century broadly, right, earlier as well as one from the contemporary period. We have two that overtly engage with sexual proclivities, while we have two that could be easily transitioned into that sort of reading. But when we think about what it is that we are doing here in a symposium that's titled The Politics of Choice, I want us to instead return back to that original suggestion that I had at the introduction of this session, that was that to choose was to position oneself in relation to something else. And I think that when we start to think about each of these works of cultural production as a form of engagement, as an action, as a verb, we get some very interesting similarities in all of these distinct situations. If I go through each of your papers, I try to think of a singular verb that would encapsulate everything here. Gabrielle, I came with the idea of confrontation. that you have Benoit really confronting these established racial stereotypes and also perceptions of both womanhood and race as well too, and really challenging our social perceptions of racism at the start of the 19th century. Madison, I was thinking of self-definition here, this idea that Milton framed Satan as someone who was relatable, as empathetic, as someone we could see ourselves in, and forcing us to ask, do we define ourselves with Satan? How do we choose to act? Do we follow that example, or do we follow something else? Jacob, the verb I was thinking here was censor and challenge. The idea that there could be this perspective that shifts over the course of time, how the bull could be made for one ideology and then come to represent and challenge and almost kind of embody the antithesis of its pure intention, how we can choose how we want to interpret that. And then finally for Isabella, the idea of provocation, of activism, of thinking about how one can choose to completely do something different outside of the bounds and of social sanction, and the benefits that could potentially come from choosing to disavow these prominent ideologies. This led me to think a little bit more of this idea of perspective, right? How it is that the choices made by these artists in turn transition that choice onto us. How do we approach Madeline? How do we approach Satan? How do we look at the Wall Street Bull? And more importantly, how do we deal with historical alterity? To open up my question here, I guess I want to throw that question back to all of you, which is to you all, in your studying of these artists, in your engagement with these ideas. How intentional do you think these actions were? Do you think that your artists were trying to compel our politics to change? Do you think that they were trying to accomplish this social engagement? Or do you think that it was more personal, that it was just a matter of their decisions and the larger society, it didn't matter essentially what they thought about this choice? So I will just throw it back for anyone who would like to summarize, right? Where does the controversy lie, right? Does it lie in how the artwork is received, or does it rely in just how the artist intended it to function?
I guess I'll take it. So with my artwork, with the charging bull, I think almost all of the artistic choices Arturo Demodica made when he was sculpting this, I think he was very aware of how the sculpture was intended to be received, and that was by in the public sphere. So it wasn't entirely personal. It certainly was in its inception and its making, like in the point of its being made. But I think he was very aware of how he knew it was going to be seen and how he knew people were going to take it. So I think his choices of artistic technicality, I guess, would be hyper aware of the fact that he's not making it just for himself, but he's making it for people like him, people who kind of were inspired by the opportunities America had to offer financially. So, because I think I said in my paper, he came here as an immigrant, so he was also hyper aware of the choices that he was making. He was also making kind of as a representative of people like him or people to come after him. So I think he certainly was operating under the eye of the viewer as opposed to the eye of the artist.
Thank you.
Well, I think I can add a thing, I guess. Well, I think this can be said about all of them, but I can only speak for my piece. But I feel like there's all intentions behind each work from the artist, but most of them were received in maybe a wholly different way. I know that Aubrey Beardsley was certainly intentionally a provocateur, but but I don't think he ever intended the scope of it. He was like a hermit. He very much lived a very like self-contained life. He had tuberculosis, so he couldn't really exit his own home. But it was a lot of just doing things for the sake of doing them, just to shake things up a bit and being inspired by Japanese erotica, and same with France, just very sort of provocative stuff. But yeah, unintentionally so, I think it creates communities, and people gravitate towards whatever imagery they do. But I think it might be more about the response than what was intentionally, what was at first the idea behind it. It's always more of a personal thing for the artist, but it always turns into something so much more. I think that's the case with most art.
I think it's very dependent on the time period in which the art was created. Like, you have to look at the context as an important factor when you're considering choice. And I didn't touch upon this in my presentation, but when you look at the political climate of France at the time when Benoit created this portrait, there was movements for feminist movements in France because there were codes placed by Napoleon that were restricting female rights. There was the emancipation of slaves in 1794, and then that was reversed when Napoleon ruled again. So you have to imagine that there was some conscious thought when Marie made this portrait, because at the time the salon was mainly for men. It was all white, and if the emancipation was reversed, then the view on slavery definitely would have been a very contentious point. So I think that my artist was certainly aware that this would cause some backlash, but I also think that there was a lot of self-motivating factors as well, because as a woman artist, she would have some self-serving interests in making sure that a woman made her presence known at the salon.
For my artist, it was very interesting in that Milton actually did intend to make Lucifer the way that he made him, and that he was made to be a reflection of our own inner selfish desires and pride. And as this art has progressed, as we have, the view has become so much broader. Milton himself, he was also bedridden. He was suffering from blindness. There's actually a painting of his daughters writing down all the lines for Paradise Lost because he was not able to write them himself. And he was also on the brink of a changing time period that would impact us in the Western world for all time. And it is very interesting to see. It was very much what he intended, not quite to the magnitude of what he intended. And he did face backlash for this work. However, due to a lot of religious freedom increasing, it actually made him more successful and more praised as well. So it's very much a catch-22, so to speak.
Do you think it's important that we reinterpret these artworks as we progress in time? Such as I'm thinking of like the portrait of Madeline, of how views on race have changed significantly since 1800. I'm thinking of the Wall Street Bull and of how Occupy Wall Street changes. I'm thinking of of views on religion. I'm thinking also again of this idea towards pre-Stonewall, post-Stonewall queer rights. how important is that change for you all? Is it something that we need to understand both in its historical moment, or is it something that has power in its own kind of changing life after the artist leaves the story?
Can you say that question one more time?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted.
Yes, I think we all did. So basically what I was asking was that how important is the afterlife of these artistic objects? That is, so they're made with these intentions at a historic moment. But for all of your examples, things change over time. Right? Values change, perspectives that we bring to our interrogation of these change. So I guess, how important is that for you? Is it really important that we reassess these objects today, now, and continue to reassess them? Or do we need to continue to mine that historical moment of importance? And so is that phrase clearer?
Yes. I think it's, as someone working in history, it is so difficult to put yourself into someone else's shoes, in that you did not walk the life that they have led. And sometimes it is important to always kind of frame what they were thinking in the historical context. But it's also, I think, one of the big reasons why these works still preserve today is cultural relevancy, because these art pieces have been deemed artistically significant and thus they survive. I believe another question could be whether if something is culturally relevant, does it still matter to our current consciousness?
Sorry, Isabel, you can go. I saw you turn your mic off.
Okay, I'll be brief. But I think this is it's a very broad conversation to have because we're living in a time now where that conversation is more relevant than ever. There's a lot of pieces that sometimes we choose to remove it for better context. They're always still going to be culturally relevant, but sometimes things can get a little bit heated in the art history world. Like images of leaders, for example, as well. There's a lot of iconoclasm that happens. And I think that's also important too. It's important to see how powerful an image could be that someone would want to destroy it or remove it. And that always it really adds to it. But yeah, no, I think it's always constantly important to reassess something because times will consistently change and progress, and that's a positive thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a positive thing too, because I mean, if we leave artworks in the context which they were made, I mean, I think we'd still have that statue of Teddy Roosevelt on the horse with the Native American and Black people walking beneath him, which I think was, even for the time, it's like a little it's a little iffy at best. So I think it's very good to reassess artworks because it kind of gets rid of biases that people had at the time. And because we can always look back and say that it's how it was, but that doesn't mean it was right. Or in context of like my artwork, it's how it was originally better than probably how it's perceived today, as sort of the symbol for these major institutions which kind of have taken advantage of almost everyone in America. So it's like things evolve over time. So it's very important to look at how they've evolved, and a lot of historical artworks certainly do not hold up to the standards of today. And I think it's important to note, to provide context before looking at them again.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that was said. It can be really tempting to fall into this anachronistic reading of artwork, especially when there's so many pressing social issues today, and we want to read these artists as if they were thinking about the same issues during the time that their works were created. And maybe they were. We'll never know for sure unless we ask them. But I don't necessarily see that as a problem either if we're if we're reading these works anachronistically, it might not be historically correct, but I think if we continue to if we give new meaning to art, it can be a figurehead for issues that we're trying to resolve today, especially with concerning race, gender, financial needs, anything really.
As a historian of the 18th and 19th century myself, I wholeheartedly endorse your answers. I think you're all spot on here. And I think it ties together nicely in the fact that we as historians, as people who look at the past, who are responsible for forming interpretations, for reinterpreting the past, it's a political choice on our end as well too, right? Like we are actively responding to the choices made by these artists with our own equally political choices, and it forms this kind of dialogue, right, that puts us as part of this kind of social, political, public discourse. I know there's some questions in the chat. Let's see. I want to make sure we leave some time for that. We have some thanks. We have our unfortunate spammer. I'm sorry for all that. We talked about artists leaving the. Let's see. All right. So Jacob asks Isabella, excuse me, what motives, imagery, or ideas might the climax have which drew queer fans? I am not versed in queer art, and I'm interested how queer fans might have identified so strongly with such a work.
Okay, so the paper was originally like pretty extended, but so the idea behind it was that a lot of the imagery that he's using was also provocative, and there's a lot of provocation in the queer community. It goes hand in hand to an extent, because in order to make space, you kind of have to shake things up a bit. But a lot of what was going on with the sort of visual motifs are mostly the playing with gender. There's another piece that I examined in the paper that I took out, unfortunately, but it was John and Salome was the name of that piece. And it was very, Salome was depicted in a very masculine way, in an exposed way. Her bare breasts and her stomach were out. And John the Baptist was very feminine. He had like beautiful, luscious hair, you know, like he was very demure and more subservient, as would a woman be presented usually. So he did a lot of that, playing around with gender and sexuality. And that was definitely something that attracted queer viewers, but also Salome did the play. It turned into a French play because it was a little too much for English audiences. So Oscar Wilde debuted it there, and when he did, the audience was very much a lot of people who were part of the working class, and people on the outsiders, people you'd consider deviants, were the people that were consuming it at the time. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that was popular with that community at the time. And Oscar Wilde, of course, is one of those queer icons in history that was subsequently persecuted. He ended up in prison and did manual labor for about 2 years. And because of that association that he had with Aubrey Beardsley lost his job as an editor-in-chief for a magazine. So yeah, for a lot of those reasons, there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding everything, the art and the artist. But those are some things that I think a lot of people can relate to. But yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. We are just about out of time, but there is one more question from Zoe, and so it's for Gabrielle. It says, you mentioned a connection between Benoit and also Edmonia Lewis. And so could you speak more on on this connection? And then if I could just tack one onto that. As we conclude this first session, I was wondering if each of you could just briefly say, do you have any plans to follow up with these projects as well too? So two-part question. I apologize for combining both of them together, but I shall turn it back over to you. So Gabrielle, do you have anything more to say on the connection between between Benoit and Lewis?
Yeah, I can actually answer both of your questions in the same answer. That is actually what the extension of my paper is going to be. I'm taking an art history reading and research course over the summer, and I plan to explore that a little bit more. The thing that I found really interesting about Edmonia is that she's known for these really powerful subjects about slavery, and interestingly, she chooses to use white marble and have very European features as she represents topics of slavery. And she is an African American and Native American artist, and Benoit was a white artist depicting a Black woman. So I really want to explore this dynamic between race and gender, and what their intention was between that. They're also both depicting women leaving slavery. Benoit's servant was just recently freed from colonial slavery and brought into French white society, bourgeois society. And Edmonia's Forever Free sculpture is showing the woman entering white society after being emancipated. So I really want to explore that in an extension of this paper.
And so future plans for any of my panel before we conclude.
Well, this is actually my second symposium for this paper, so
Excellent.
That's pretty exciting. But yeah, no, I'd definitely like to take it further. As I said, there's an extended version. It's about 30 or so pages. So if I could get it published, that would be an amazing feat for me. But I guess for now, it's kind of just working towards going to school again and seeing where that takes me.
Take over, Madison.
Oh, sorry, Madison. You go.
Hey, so personally, I would love to extend this project. It's finding the stuff to extend it because right now I'm trying to pull together a lot of the resources to extend this project. I believe the original is around 14 pages long, but I would love to extend it and reach into some wider themes, but I'll just have to see where life takes me.
I think I'd just like to clean up the writing of it. I think I'd like to extend it and speak more on Fearless Girl, because that has been embroiled in legal troubles since they debuted it between the artist and the company that commissioned it and everything, and Arturo Monica. So it's still a very changing piece and interpretation wise. So I think I'd like to speak more on that. But otherwise, I think it's a lot more fun to write about. If I could.
Well, thank you all again for these wonderful papers. Thank you for this wonderful conversation as well too. This concludes our first session, and of the symposium today. I believe we can take maybe like a 3 to 5 minute break, Adira. Do you think that would be a good thing?
Sounds good, yeah.
And then we will meet back here to start session 2.
And as I said at the beginning, or I don't think I actually said, I am Adira Kazi, and I'm the Curator of Education at the Hunter Museum. And I've had the privilege of working with these amazing students along with Dr. Amanda Bellis over the semester. And so this second portion, we are looking at the politics of choice within the institutional artistic space. And we have 3 papers that, while we selected them and grouped them for that reason, also have a strong corporeal component, and particularly the way the body is controlled by the institution and the sexuality and representation of that body is controlled. So with that, I'm going to start with our first presentation, and I will share the screen and make sure the audio works perfectly this time. Apologies for earlier. By Elliot O'Rourke.
Hello.
Thank you for inviting me to present at the Hunter Museum Symposium. I'll be presenting today on Felix Gonzalez Torres's untitled Perfect Lovers and the Politics of Museum Presentation. Felix Gonzalez Torres was a pioneer in using the conceptual and aesthetic language of queer minimalism during the tense political atmosphere of the AIDS crisis to infiltrate the museum world and avoid censorship. His work uses the legacy of the ready-made and mass-produced, as well as audience interaction, in order to embody subtle yet controversial political themes, including the rampant fetishization of objects in the art world, gay rights, and censorship of queer artists. Though the subtlety of his art's themes and messaging was revolutionary at the time of its production and crucial to Gonzalez Torres's ability to infiltrate the mainstream art world during the AIDS crisis, shifting cultural norms have rendered his work harder to read by modern audiences, who are poised by mainstream visibility of gay artists to take the understated nature of Gonzalez Torres's work as being unapproachable, as opposed to a survival tactic. Felix Gonzalez Torres rose to prominence in conceptual minimalism as the AIDS crisis sent the country spiraling into an anti-gay crusade. In 1981, the first cases of AIDS in the United States were identified in California, and several months later, the phrase, the gay cancer, became publicly used, fueling the intense stigma around AIDS. 2 years later, famous gay photographer Robert Mapplethorpe's retrospective was canceled after the public outcry. Mapplethorpe had died of AIDS complications. Other prominent controversies included an attempted withdrawal of support from the National Endowment of Arts for Witnesses against art banishing, an exhibition in 1989 in response to the AIDS crisis, with many pieces that addressed and presented the gay body. From very early on in his career, Gonzalez Torres's work was concerned with activism, minority rights, and challenging the institutional art world. In the late 1980s, Gonzalez Torres became a long-standing member of Group Material. Group Material was a collective activist artist group that used interactive conceptual art to participate in widespread political messaging. Gonzalez Torres shared the group's sentiments and was later involved in their series Democracy, a 4-part interactive exhibition that addressed, among other things, elections, education, and the ongoing AIDS crisis. Gonzalez Torres's work involved political activism and gay liberation on both a personal and a professional level from the beginning. Untitled Perfect Lovers presents one of the more subtle of Gonzalez Torres's ready-made works to achieve widespread popularity, alongside his candy works. Unlike his candy works, the audience interaction with Untitled Perfect Lovers must necessarily be derived from observing the work, and it cannot be touched. When observed, the piece appears understated and could be written off as a mere quirk of interior design, were it not for a conspicuously placed museum plaque. As Gordon Hall, author of Object Lessons, notes, Gonzalez Torres's work pointedly favors sleek, almost corporate imagery that borrows from the language of minimalism while simultaneously embodying LGBT themes or references. Much as with Group Material's The People's Choice, Duchamp's Fountain, and other work by Gonzalez Torres himself, Untitled Perfect Lovers presents the viewer with a question. At what point are these paired institutional clocks art? What quality creates this? Differentiates the 2 clocks as one from the thousands of identical clocks in waiting rooms, jails, classrooms, and offices around the United States? What creates a work of art in the consciousness of a viewer, and what does the viewer do with the art once seen? These questions haunt the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres. The process of memory making in the 1980s was a politically fraught and evolving one, and the prospect of enshrining the memory of those who had AIDS in cultural institutions was a dangerous one, liable always to be seen through and rejected. Gonzalez Torres's Untitled Perfect Lovers utilizes the language of minimalism in order to subvert the very expectations and hallmarks of the movement that it emulates. The key to Untitled Perfect Lovers lies in the single point of contact as well as the title. Without those, it is no longer recognizable as a work of art and loses the desire and the tension that the 2 clocks express by virtue of being at once intimately connected and also unable to merge fully, unable to become closer or one without losing their function. There is a certain type of universalism engendered in Perfect Lovers through the use of such bare-bones ready-made clocks. The desire to remain in stasis expressed can be sanitized and made more relatable through the exclusion of Gonzalez Torres's personal context, which is inextricably linked to Perfect Lovers. In his letter to Ross in 1988, Gonzalez Torres included a preliminary sketch of Untitled Perfect Lovers, herein labeled simply as Lovers. Below the sketch is the titular letter to Ross, including the line, "Do not be afraid of the clocks, they are our time. Time has been so generous with us. We are synchronized now and forever. I love you." Although many art historians and gallerists choose to emphasize the ambiguous appearance of perfect lovers, this 1988 letter to Ross Laycock and the accompanying sketch demonstrate how deeply personal this particular piece is, even more than his other works. Untitled Perfect Lovers is a tribute to not only Ross Laycock, but Gonzalez Torres's dream of the two of them together, eternally gifted with time. Some may find more poignancy in not knowing the personal context, seeking relatability in a reading of the piece without the emotional toll of the history attached to it. This urge to reach a wider audience by presenting the more universal aspects of his work not only erases the tense political struggle underlying Gonzalez Torres's work, but it can also erase or damage the memory of the people made physical within the art. A common critique of retrospective exhibitions of his work is that they erase the queer undertones of his artwork, leaving visitors to attempt to puzzle out the meaning with no context, or purposely leading viewers to less controversial interpretations. Although the choice of museum institutions to present Gonzalez Torres's work with minimal context and explanation is not always malicious, arising from a need to keep wall labels accessible to the public and highlight only a select number of works in the exhibition, it's still an active choice that must be made. Each time this choice is made, the effect becomes more pronounced and accumulates an aura of ambiguity around Gonzalez Torres's work. As recently as March of 2017, the conservative, aesthetic-focused presentation of his work was manifested at the David Zwirner Gallery in New York City, where the term AIDS was not mentioned anywhere. While it might be considered reductive to examine all of a queer artist's work through the lens of sexuality, this was often the both implicit and explicit purpose of Gonzalez Torres's work. As Adair Roundwaith argues in Split Witnesses, Metaphorical Extensions of Life in the Art of Felix Gonzalez Torres, the very qualities of his art that subvert the minimalist practice in which he works have aged into a kind of immortality, carefully excised from context and often displayed within theoretical frameworks. Roundwaith notes that, partially because of the art's timeless quality, the propensity on the part of curators to draw it out of its historical context has been far more marked for the works of Gonzalez Torres than for the work of any other artist of his generation. This is partially due to the nature of minimalism. It can be inscrutable and hard-edged, glossy and inapproachable to those without formal training or the knowledge to fully appreciate the efforts of the artist. The language of minimalism, once perfectly suited for slipping subversive material under the bar of the acceptable, has become occluded with time. Similarly, our collective memory of the American AIDS crisis and its devastation has also been occluded. Many of the primary witnesses succumbed to the disease, and those who didn't were drowned out by the world as it moved unceasingly onward. Modern audiences, especially after the 2015 legalization of same-sex marriage, have become accustomed to a more straightforward representation of the queer body in media. It's now possible to see explicitly queer art uplifted in museum collections and galleries across America. And also to see LGBT representation in popular media. This indicates a generally positive cultural shift, but it simultaneously creates a cultural expectations around art pieces involving gay rights and stories. Gonzalez Torres's work is more relevant than ever as the 1980s begin to disappear over the horizon of recent history, and awareness of the AIDS epidemic decreases with time. However, our continually evolving relationship with queer art and its increased visibility renders his subtle visual language, intended originally to infiltrate, unapproachable to modern viewers who are not primed with context. As curators, it becomes our responsibility to ask whether relatability and its cousin respectability at the erasure of his personal and political life is a betrayal of Gonzalez Torres's intent, and whether this enacts a kind of retrospective violence on the body of his work. Crucially, Gonzalez Torres's sculptural pieces often stand in for and represent the physical bodies of those he loves and himself. This motif heightens both our awareness of their life and simultaneously the vulnerability of their memory to modern interpretation, as audiences become more accustomed to seeing gay art as celebrated and less accustomed to parsing out political subtext beneath the surface of queer minimalist work. Thank you.
And thank you, Elliot. That was excellent and really gives us a good insight into what we have today with all three of these presenters who are really looking at that curatorial control and institutional control, and I'd also say canonical control over the body and over the sexualized body. And I'd like everyone to, and I'll bring back up that final quote that Elliot had on there about curatorial responsibility, which I'd extend to say art historical responsibility as well, as we go into our second talk. And this one is by Alex Deldago, and this is looking at the work and the photography of Angela Strassheim within a larger context of works by female artists, showing the female nude.
Thank you for inviting me to
Sorry about that. There we go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Alex Deldago, and I'm a senior undergraduate at the University of North Florida, where I am majoring in art history and history. For this symposium, I will be presenting my work titled Taboo of the Pregnant Female Form, the work of Angela Strassheim and other female artists in battle/conversation with the Eurocentric male gaze. Before I begin, I want to thank the Hunter Museum of American Art for organizing the 9th Annual Student Symposium, with this year dealing with the politics of choice. In particular, I want to give thanks to Adira Kasi and Dr. Stephen Mandrevelis for their feedback and assistance in helping this project get to where it is today. Now, without further ado, let's get started. In a November 25th, 2014 email with the subject line, Pornographic Display at MoCA, Clay Yarborough, then president of the Jacksonville, Florida Cultural City Council, expressed strong disdain for a work of art then on view at the city's Museum of Contemporary Art. In part, he stated, quote, upon entering, I saw a large picture on display of a woman with bare breasts exposed and laying in a questionable manner, end quote. The email, sent by Yarborough to Chris Hand, who was Jacksonville Mayor's chief of staff, was in reference to MoCA's display of a 2014 photograph by the artist Angela Strassheim, which he labeled as an inappropriate work of pornographic display. Yarborough then urged Jacksonville Mayor Alvin Brown to immediately pull all funding for MoCA that fiscal year, which was $233,029, unless the situation was addressed within 24 hours. In response, Hand advised Yarborough to consult the Jacksonville Mayor's Office of General Counsel, to which Jason Gabriel responded on the office's behalf, stating in part that, quote, based on relevant federal case law, the city cannot remove artwork from the museum based on what it may deem offensive, and moreover, the case law is very clear that the city cannot rescind funding for a museum, refuse to renew its lease, or otherwise sanction it based on artwork it may deem offensive. To do so would violate the museum's and possibly the artist's free speech rights, end quote. Days later, Mayor Alvin Brown put this to a halt in a letter to Yarborough stating, quote, after thoughtful consideration of your request and First Amendment issues involved, I will not seek to pull any funding that the City Council has appropriated to the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville in the current budget. This includes the Cultural Council's subsequent award of $233,029 grant to MoCA. The controversy centered around Angela Strassheim's 2014 photograph, Janine 8.5 months pregnant, pictured here. While this issue was resolved rather succinctly, the questions and debates incited by this controversy warrant a closer examination of what constitutes a work of art being considered inappropriate or pornographic, what subjects and themes are considered taboo within contemporary art history, and the dichotomy between critiques from the male gaze and the female celebration of a generative body. Through an analysis of Strassheim's work entitled Janine 8.5 months pregnant, and the subjects, themes, and messages present within this and other compositions by Strassheim and other artists, I argue that what made this specific piece so controversial and contested was not its pornographic content, but rather it being a celebration of the nude female pregnant body in a seemingly ordinary scene from everyday life. Using the tension of the Eurocentric male artistic vision versus a more holistic, broader encompassing female creative vision, I aim to better understand the ways in which political and social discourse structure and restrict certain artistic freedoms in production, as well as how artists respond and adapt to these presented challenges. If a work of art does spark controversy or cause debate, this should be promoted and encouraged, not stifled or censored. Difficult and diverse forms of creative expression ought to be commonplace in artistic and cultural institutions, sparking stimulating and intellectual thought and conversation, rather than topics of the status quo and mainstream currents. By this occurring, one can naturally pick and choose what works appeal to them and which ones do not, a natural process in a free and open society that bestows this right upon its individuals. From Tom Vesselman's 1965 Great American Nude No. 75, pictured here on the left, to Jeff Koons's 1988 Woman in a Tub, pictured here on the right, we find two artistic representations of the nude female form, both done by white male American artists. Both works reduce the female subject to two bodies without any defining facial features, characteristics, or personal attributes. Rather, the focus is purposely drawn to their breasts and the objectification of their bodies for the male gaze to enjoy and elicit a sexual or erotic feeling within the viewer. The male gaze can be defined as, quote, the sexually objectifying attitude that a representation takes towards its feminine subject matter, presenting her as a primarily passive object for heterosexual male erotic gratification, end quote. As the philosopher A.W. Eaton further points out in their work and synopsis on the history of the male gaze within Western art history, the male gaze should not be misconstrued as an empirical concept, one that concretely foresees how a viewer looks at or interprets an image. Rather, quote, the male gaze refers to the kind of response that some pictures prescribe to their viewers. The fact that this prescription can be resisted or ignored, because the viewer is, for instance, a gay man or a feminist, does not negate the fact that the male gaze is a structural feature of the pictures in question, end quote. Understanding this as a concept that has many different perspectives, interdisciplinary approaches, and ways of better understanding a work of art is critical to recognizing the work that the male gaze attempts to bring to light. Both works by Vesselman and Koons were also done with broad influences of pop, an artistic movement that largely centered around consumerism, advertising, popular culture, and the celebration of capitalism and patriotism. We see this achieved here through the objectification of the female body, and also through depicting the forms as sexualized commodities to be bought, sold, and looked at. One can only imagine the type of buyer works of art such as these by Koons and Vesselman might attract, and for what true aesthetic reason or appreciation they might get from it. Without an identity, agency, or authentic character given to these two women in these two works of art, they are left without a voice, reserved for the male viewer. It is also important to note that when researching the reception and general responses to these works of art, neither received the level of backlash, criticism, and mainstream debate or conversation surrounding pornographic art that the work by Streisand has garnered more than 4 decades later in 2014. When looking at the female creative vision towards representing the human form, both Alison Saar's 2013 sculpture Summer, pictured here on the left, as well as Annie Leibovitz's 2017 photograph of Serena Williams pregnant, here on the right, both present a more intimate, personal, and expressive point of view into the ways we can aesthetically view and appreciate the female body. Much like Streisand's Janine 8.5 months pregnant, all three of these works share a common thread that incorporates and ties in themes of strength, solidarity, and stoicism, uniting these three women and bringing them and their stories together. Unlike Vesselman and Koons's works, which were previously discussed, these female artists from different backgrounds and walks of life managed to elevate and bestow upon their subjects a radiant form of agency, an identity that emanates from the compositional plane, striking us, the viewer, in a profound way, making us want to see him more. Using the mediums of photography and sculpture, these works welcome the viewer into the space in which the subjects occupy, inviting one to move about and situate themselves within the composition. The employment of texture is also a unifying element within these pieces. From the bumps, lines, and shine created by the casted bronze of Sars's Summer, to the lights, shadows, and tactile quality of the fabric within the composition of Streisand and Leibowitz, these subtle qualities personalize the works, furthering their individual characters and likeness. When asked about the controversy surrounding this piece, the artist Angela Streisand stated that, quote, "To me, it is a very tasteful photograph. It is not done in a gross, obscene way, so it is shocking to me that there's so much attention paid to this. To me, the photograph is about this last bit of afternoon sunlight pouring in the window and her kind of embracing the warmth of that. I am surprised that in 2014, we are having an issue over breasts in a photograph," end quote. Through a look at Angela Streisand's piece, the context in which it was publicly criticized and scrutinized, as well as other works of art that were both similar and vastly different in regard to the subject matter, meaning, and intention behind it, it becomes evident that there still exists a clear divide between artistic work produced primarily for the male gaze in mind, done from a Eurocentric lens, and the creative work that comes from a more holistic and inclusive point of view, usually celebrating the female form in the process, rather than simply objectifying it or over-commercializing it in the name of comedy, satire, or popular culture. While this research project has only begun to scrape the surface of a deep and convoluted history of art in relation to gender, race, and class, much more work is to be done with the hopes of a better understanding and appreciation for works of art that push against the mainstream, challenging us to think of things often outside of our own comfort zone. I am particularly interested in further investigating how artists like Streisand and Saar use the mediums of photography and sculpture to further encompass the viewer, as a result, often further challenging us to push us to see their ideas and work in an alternative way. Also, I believe this work will greatly benefit from further research into the work done by marginalized female-identifying artists, and more specifically, works of art that depict the human figure in themes of motherhood, aging, development, etc. The canon of art history is always constantly being reimagined, reconfigured, and reinterpreted in new and exciting ways, to include more focus on artists like Streisand and works like Janine 8.5 Months Pregnant, figures and pieces that expand our artistic appreciation and knowledge of places, things, and experiences different from our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. And that was a fantastic bridge piece, because as we look at the body, at the generative body, at the queer body, we continue to come upon this pushback from the institutions and the societies in which they're created. And each of these papers are looking at that. And we're continuing with photography with our next talk, but going into looking at queer bodies, but also more broadly, the bodies created by a queer artist. And this next talk is by Zoe Lakin, and it is exploring the incredible photography of artist Lola Flash.
Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon. My name is Zoe Lakin, and today I will be presenting Context Doesn't Kill, Lola Flash's cross-color photography in the indifference of museum and media. Lola Flash produced a series of cross-color photographs during the 1980s and 1990s, some from ACT UP demonstrations in New York and Washington, D.C., and others shot in London, Fire Island, and Provincetown. Since June 4th, 2021, 7 of these photographs are in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. The photographs are currently on display on the second floor, dedicated to works from the 1970s to the present. Despite the growing public interest in her work, as evidenced in the recent uptick in articles on her, as well as the Lifetime Achievement Award she was recently presented with for queer art, her photographs remain marginalized and the significance of her innovative visual style unrecognized. The photograph's use of creative, historically significant subject matter, coupled with cross-color processing and dynamic use of space, inverts binaries and obscures identities, giving her activism a new visual language, which deserves more recognition than it has received. This presentation will focus on the iconographical and formal elements of Flash's cross-color photographs, as well as their critical reception. I would also like to add a small note up top that Flash uses both she, her, and they, them pronouns. Flash's career as an activist and artist is key to understanding her photograph's content and form, and it sheds light on the context of the photograph's production and her intentions. During the late 80s and early 90s, Flash was an active member of ACT UP and Art Plus, an affinity group centering issues around people of color affected by the AIDS crisis. And she was even featured on the iconic 1989 poster, Kissing Doesn't Kill, Greed and Indifference Do. She has always seen her camera as a tool to extend her work as an activist. For 2 decades, Flash utilized cross-color, a process she stumbled across accidentally in the darkroom, to build her own stunning visual vocabulary to address civil rights issues, new and old. One reason Flash's works deserve more recognition is the fact that they present historically significant subject matter using photographic styles that are unusual and surprising for such documentary content. Flash states that her work explores complex subject matter, which allows her to blur borders and explore and manipulate perceptions of identity. Other photographs from the series and the broader body of her cross-color work include more people, often friends or acquaintances of the artist, at demonstrations or about their daily lives. Still others feature more overtly bleak subjects, like in Foray from 1990, where a lone wheelchair sits on a beach, which looks more like the surface of a desert planet thanks to cross-color. Flash notes that seeing the wheelchair on the beach one day reminded her of her friend Ray, who had died from AIDS. With reversed colors and creative uses of spatial arrangements, Flash's cross-color works prove that happy accidents can yield decades of stylistic innovation and impact. Flash began experimenting with cross-color during her undergraduate work. At that point, Flash was printing on Cibachrome paper. As she explains in an artist talk, this paper, though capable of producing rich colors, was quite difficult to manipulate. Frustrated with hours spent in the darkroom without the results she wanted, she realized that she had a surplus of negative paper and began printing on that instead. Flash eventually came to realize that she was drawn to the reversal for its ability to flip the expected color binary. Flash further explained that the process allows her to get rid of the typical black and white binary system and instead provide some level of autonomy for those pictured, while simultaneously obscuring identities and presences. By reversing the colors one expects to see in photographs, especially photographs of people who are thought to have a certain color skin, Flash creates an alternate picture of the world. Throughout her career, Flash has been interested in providing new ways of seeing, and in the earlier decades, cross-color was one of the main ways she did so. The cross-coloring often works within bold compositions to further enhance the sense of distortion. In AIDS is Killing Artist, Self-Portrait, for instance, the slight tilt of the camera as it focuses on a reclined figure calls into question expectations of space and gravity. The figure is clearly lying down, but the body retains its verticality in the composition and tilts out into the viewer's space slightly. Flash plays on the idea of the subject tilting out into the viewer's space, but this is disorienting when the plane of the image is so horizontal and flat. This strange sense of space within the composition is echoed throughout several of Flash's photographs, especially those taken during protests and rallies, which speaks to her ability to give very historical moments a chaotic sense of uncanniness and very real figures a sense of ethereality. Flash's works were only recently acquired by the MoMA this past summer, and they really have received almost no scholarly analysis and only a handful of brief critical reviews and articles in journals like the British Journal of Photography, Hyperallergenic, Aperture, and a few others. The timing of these articles suggests that the sudden increase in media coverage might have something to do with performative attempts at racial, gender, and sexual equity after decades of exclusion. Flash's work is certainly not shy in its subject matter or form, and the context in which much of it was made, the AIDS crisis, still carries very specific connotations in the minds of many. Another interesting note on the timing of these articles is their concisions with the COVID-19 pandemic. Often the comparison is made, but the stigmatization of queer communities is ignored or relatively glossed over. I had the opportunity to speak with Flash myself last month via Zoom after reaching out to her on Instagram. When I asked her what she thought of the placement of her works in the MoMA, Flash had a sort of better late than never opinion on their acquisition and the general increase in media coverage and public attention she has received over the past few years. In terms of their location in an unusual viewing space in the MoMA, she thinks that this space is an interesting location for her photographs and that they can function as a sort of eye-catching entry point to a floor of works which often explore themes of racism and homophobia. As Flash noted in our conversation and in other interviews, her works stand out amidst other photography and AIDS photography specifically. While they are documentary in nature, they provide a very different mode of presenting documentation of historical events. Their use of color is surprising and initially draws people in for that very reason. If the reversal of color can act as a hook to get people really looking closely at the images, their subject matter is then more likely to be looked at carefully as well. While Flash did not discuss dissatisfaction with the specific placement of her photographs in their space in the MoMA, I still ultimately find this placement a bit underwhelming and isolating. Although the images can operate as a visual entry point, which catches the attention of visitors through their creative and formal elements, their environment does not provide the same level of visual command and engagement that the environments right around the corner from them do. At least in my experience as a visitor, and certainly others have different experiences. I can, though, point to the fact that the images are placed directly in front of the escalators and in the same entry space as the bathrooms. So the level of foot traffic creates a less than ideal viewing experience, especially when the museum is busy. For an artist who has worked consistently for over 4 decades to push the conversation on topics relating to the racial, gender, and sexual intersections of identity using new color and spatial language, Flash remains largely underrepresented. With the acquisition earlier this year of 7 of her photographs into the MoMA's permanent collection and an increased public awareness for the importance of a wider and more diverse canon, there is hope that this will change for the better. Flash closes one interview by stating, quote, "I want to make sure the work is contextualized properly alongside my peers so that people can see the validity of my photography." Flash reiterates that she seeks to pioneer new ways of seeing through her images, and that desire is evident in her use of an alternative approach to color and space.
Thank you, Zoe. And thanks to all 3 of you for presenting some really intriguing pieces and leading us into what I hope will be a fascinating discussion. Each of you, by chance or deliberately, selected artists for whom you had direct access or at least tertiary access. Artists who you are able to find out their intention, their vision, and how they would like these works manifest. And as you know, that's a privilege of working with contemporary artists often, and you can see that in contrast with some of the students in the first section of the symposium who were working with whatever materials were left. So with that, you were able to go into a deeper dive between artists' intention and the way that their works were presented or represented by their communities, by the museums, and by the media at large. And something else that I thought was really interesting for each of you is that each of your artists, in one form or another, use their medium as almost a form of subversion, as I believe Elliot used as a term in describing Felix Gonzalez Torres' use of minimalism. So for Felix Gonzalez Torres, the Torres minimalism was, of course, a stylistic choice and perhaps a deliberate one at a time that during the AIDS crisis and somewhat closeting or at least silencing of gay partnerships was taking place. But also, even in doing so, he left very deliberate messaging and a lovely letter exploring what this piece really meant, something that hasn't been shown, as far as I could tell from your paper, in any of the, or in most of the representations of the works. Likewise, Alex found an artist whose beautiful and unguarded work of generative femininity came to such a slight to the point of someone actually asking it to be taken off view in a way that we might expect that kind of reaction 20, 30, 40, more likely 70 years ago. So it's a little bit shocking that it's still happening, and it causes us to question really how far we've progressed and how far institutions have progressed, particularly in this age of political visibility, as well as very accessible media for people to voice their opinions and to take a role in what art is considered appropriate for the public sphere. And then finally, Zoe, with the great opportunity to actually speak to Lola Flash, who knew the power of Instagram, to get to speak with some of your artistic heroes and to really see how some of the things that have happened recently could be because of a sort of institutional reckoning with this work. But Flash made some really deliberate decisions with this very ethereal visual world that she created, and created this very visually lush space that had been heretofore sort of ignored and is now being shown. But as Zoe astutely pointed out with that wonderful little iPhone, I assume, video, getting a chance to really see how it's being shown by one of the very notable cultural institutions of the US, but in a space where we could see foot traffic was walking right by it. And it wasn't quite a space to sit and consume it and understand it, particularly in the context of other works from its period. So each of you had these works that are incredibly powerful, received backlash or obfuscation or erasure. And each of you came in when you each started with very strong points. The institution is censoring. And that's something we in museums often experience people seeing as a first response, and it's a valid first response. So I asked each of you to grapple with the many considerations a museum makes, from the aesthetic, of course, to balancing different institutional interests, as well as just accessibility, and accessibility meaning simply that everyone has access to these ideas so that they can then further explore their own. But Elliot, as you remember, I said at the very beginning to remember that great quote. And Elliot, I apologize, I'm kind of taking it and then changing it a bit and running with it just to broaden it for the others. But as Elliot said, as curators, it becomes our responsibility to ask whether relatability and its cousin respectability are done at the expense and possible erasure of artistic intent. And so with that Yeah, and piecing together both each of your knowledge of the artistic vision and also the challenge that you were faced with imagining institutional reasoning, because I realized getting someone at the MoMA to answer you, and of course at the Art Center in Florida to understand, or to go back and to ask every curator who ever works with Felix Gonzalez Torres' work, their reasoning gets a little bit cumbersome. But as you each grappled with that concept of balancing the reality of what a museum is considering with the very possible situation of censorship or obfuscation, could you each talk about that pathway? Because I think it was a little bit challenging for each of you to go through. I'll let any of you start.
I'll start. I think one thing that stood out to me based on what you were saying, Adira, is just the really interesting overlap between artist intent and meaning, and then also the public institution or the cultural institution behind the exhibition or display of a certain work of art. And I think with my case study specifically, it was really interesting to look at and study how this political figure was responding to a work in a public institution, because the Museum of Contemporary Art here in Jacksonville is publicly owned by the University of North Florida, and as a result is open to public funding and public scrutiny, as we saw. And it's interesting because a lot of museums, that isn't the case. A lot of museums are private and they have the ability to kind of hold their own or stand firm on their ground in regards to what they show or what they don't show and how they use their funds. But luckily with, I think the MoCA here in Jacksonville has a great example or story of being a solid figure with Angela Streisand when the political individual did come out so strong against the work of art itself. The museum did a fantastic job at echoing its sentiments about First Amendment rights and the ability to not censor free speech or artistic individuality. And even the director herself at the time came out really strong and worked with the public to kind of raise awareness to modern day censoring of images that, like you said, 70 years ago, we might expect that to come about, not in 2014 or even today in 2022. So I think it's a really interesting example, because that's not to say that all cultural institutions are as progressive or hands-on with dealing with such matters. A lot of times it's the opposite. So I think I was really fascinated by this case study because it was such a good example of the museum holding its own, making sure the artist who is still living today had the proper due diligence and justice to defend her work, and then to see the kind of public response and conversation that came about from it.
Excellent, thank you. Zoe or Elliot? Zoe, go for it.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say, Alex, what you were talking about the artist's intention versus its reception after the work is put in a public sphere, that kind of got me thinking about the fact that for my artist, Lola Flash, her work and its reception, it was a challenging process to even gather enough information about her work and about this like specific body of work to write a paper on to begin with, because there's so little scholarly information out there about her. Most of the resources you find about her are interviews or just, like press type journal or press type articles about her, a couple actual art journals. And so that made it hard to even get a sense of what the reception is around her in the scholarly world, even though she's been producing work for decades now, like coming up on 40 years of work. So that was kind of part of why I felt like I needed to interview her to understand more her perspective and also how she feels her work has been received. Interviewing her was amazing. I can't believe that even happened. But that was something that she touched on. We talked about a little bit when I did interview her, was kind of the lack of scholarly analysis on her. And yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have, and it's a very broad one when you have these artists who've been working for so long that don't have a whole lot of scholarly research on them. I found one like PhD dissertation that was on her, and that was really it. She was mentioned in a couple of scholarly articles, kind of, but not really spotlighted or discussed in depth at all. And so, you know, like Adair, you mentioned earlier, it's kind of the institutional world draws on the art historical world. And so you can't curate an exhibition or write wall text for an exhibition without a, you know, large scholarly body of work. And she was in one big group show in 2021 called let me have it written down, the Rebel Dykes Art and Archive Show. And that show was very comprehensive. It was meant to be sort of an intergenerational look at lesbian art from artist Lola Flash's time and before, all the way up to more current artists. And so that was big for contextualization of Lola Flash and other artists, but that's kind of the only big contextualization of her that's exists out there, and there's not a lot of reviews on it. So yeah, that's the main issue that I was interested in.
And that's a great point, that relationship between the art historical world and the museum world. And you're being kind to giving us too much credit. Sometimes the museum world can step out where the art historical world hasn't. So I think in the case of Lola Flash, it might be both. And Elliot, now you have an artist who's been written about, heavily shown widely, is a canonical artist, but for whom representation and interpretation has not always been as open about what he saw as his intended meaning. So could you speak a little more about how you grappled with that?
Yeah, I think that González Torres is a really interesting case study in that, because there is a noted entanglement of the curatorial and the art historical worlds. A lot of the people who write on him knew him personally to some degree. Julie Alt, for example, is one of his major biographers. She was also a very close personal friend. So it can be very difficult to kind of maintain a balance, I think, for the institutional world as a whole, in what sense to approach his work. There's been some complaint over the years that many people have taken too personal an approach. This is a criticism sometimes of Alt's biographies of him, as well as other people who knew him personally. There has also been kind of a backlash to the opposite, which is that sometimes in leading too far away from the personal, people focus on the theoretical aspects of his work. González Torres was deeply influenced by Brecht, for example. So when people seek to move away from the personal, they often veer quite hard into the conceptual. And so I think that there is a balancing act there that has perhaps become more and more divided in recent years. The gallery, the David Zwirner Gallery, that exhibition was very recent, although it's 2022 now, and that's insane. I guess it's maybe not that recent. It feels very recent. And I think that a part of the problem with this kind of shifting division of approach is that as his life dates kind of recede into the past, along with like the circumstances surrounding his life, we are more and more split between the two ways that you can present his work. And it's hard to say, to look ahead and to predict which will ultimately win out, or if there will be a balance. So I think that that's a very difficult consideration for people to make. It's not resolved. There's a lot of scholarship on both. There's a lot of scholarship about him overall, which is very different from Lola Flash, for example. There's clearly a dearth of scholarship on them and plenty on González Torres.
Excellent. And you actually handed me the next question, which is, I know each of you have thought about, in a perfect world, what would this look like? What would the perfect exhibit or catalog raisonné or approach to your artist's work be, so that people could look at them in the context of specific contemporaries or in the context of specific themes that you think have been underlooked and ignore the ones that have been overlooked. So could each of you, in your perfect world, pretend money's not an object and nobody cares if you borrow their art for an extended loan? What would you have in that exhibit, and what would that theme be?
If I can go first, I guess.
Yes.
I think that with Felix Gonzalez Torres, he was an incredibly prolific speaker and writer. He did interviews, he had personal writings, he was a professor. I think it would be an incredible step forward to have an exhibition of him presented in his own words. He didn't shy away from analysis of his own work, despite the sometimes aesthetic ambiguity of it. And I think that that would definitely be a step in the right direction in terms of the way that his work is presented. I think that pairing the two of those things, his academic work with his artistic work, would be an interesting endeavor, and I would love to see that.
Excellent. Maybe we'll get you working on that. So who's up next?
I can go. I think I would maybe take one of two directions, in that I would either want to contextualize her work in a similar manner that the Rebel Dyke Archive and Art exhibition did, in that it's specifying art that's made by lesbian artists and across different generations, just so that you do have that generational comparison, because that's also something that Flash talks about a lot in her interviews, and that she cares about a lot, is the generational component and like intergenerational learning and remembering. And so I think that would be an interesting pathway to go down. I think another thing would be to compare her work to some other AIDS photography that was being produced at the same time that hers was. And then maybe some photography after, like in the decade or so after that first body of work that she made, just to kind of trace some shifts in documentary and portrait style photography. She talks in one of her artist talks about like some of the influences that she's had on her photographic style, and how she feels like she sees her work and reflected in some others. And there's a really good article about her. It's like interviewing her and Joan E. Byron and Tiona Nakia McLeodin, and they all kind of talk about the ways their work has been influenced by others as well. So just to kind of have a more like stylistic contextualization, I think could be good.
No, I think that that's an excellent answer. Either one would be big steps forward, and it sounds like she'd do both, and probably a lot of the other artists in that first one are do one as well. So Alex, you sort of gave some hints at what you would do with this paper. So is that the direction you'd take an exhibit, or would you go slightly differently?
I think kind of like bouncing off the paper, I think I really liked what Zoe was saying a minute ago in regards to when you're looking at certain contemporary art and artists, the body of work or scholarly literature can be lacking or outweighed or overlooked by the contemporary journalistic or mainstream view of the artist or the art. So I think it'd be really interesting to take an artist like Angela Streisand, who has received such public journalistic attention and political attention, and kind of ground her work back in the academic discourse of art history, and looking at themes like I kind of addressed in my paper in regards to how other work dealing or depicting the pregnant female body is used in the artistic mechanics. I think that's a really underrepresented form in art history. And when looking at other works that I was trying to pull from for the pregnant female body in art, is very few and far between. There's a lot of art that exists of mother and child or mothering and children, but there's a really tiny canon of the pregnant female body and the experience of motherhood or pregnancy as a whole. So I think to really kind of focus an exhibit on that, and also kind of more philosophically look at the ways of queer mothering. There's a really interesting philosopher named Shelley Park who looks at specifically the ways in which different forms of mothering that goes against the mainstream form of life or society can be queered or looked at in an alternative way. And I think Angela Streisand's one example of someone who uses the female body in a nonconformist, innovative way. So to possibly have an exhibit that deals with queer motherhood or the definition of what it means to be an alternative mother would be really fascinating and really kind of fruitful for museums, but also the general public who sees that.
Absolutely, you guys gave some great answers and looks into the future of what all of our fields can hope to see with this work, and hopefully in scholarship that each of you want to do in your futures as well. And as we wrap up, I think I see some lovely notes of each of you to each other, but did anyone else have any questions? Or Steve, is there anything you'd like to add to these panelists or any of our earlier panelists as well?
These are all great papers. I don't have anything too profound to add here. I think you covered it extremely well, Adira. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, the panelists, for the time and energy and real passion you put into this. I really do hope each of you move forward with these papers as you're discussing doing. And I hope to see some of those exhibits within my lifetime. So you guys got to get cracking and get people out there making these exhibits and also writing these books, writing these articles, getting these ideas published, because there's some really strong stuff here. And we all need to reconsider how we're seeing things and reconsider the politics of choice that have led to sometimes a little canonical digging in that maybe we need to undig a bit. And with that, I think I'll just thank everyone. We are recording this and we'll make sure it's available on YouTube to everyone afterwards as well. And bravo and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adira and Stephen, for coordinating all of this too.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity and for all your work on it.
Thank you. This has been great. It's been a really great time.
Thank you. It's been a great opportunity.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and support.
Well, the future is very bright with you all in this field and discipline, and I look forward to following your work throughout the years going forward.
Absolutely. Great job, everyone.